Before you sign anything, Arthur, you need to see this. My son, Leo, slid a cracked silver tablet across my home office desk. It was the exact same afternoon my wife, Clara, had smiled at me across a mediation table, waiting to take half of the logistics company I had built from nothing. She thought her timing was flawless. She did not know her old cloud account had just synced. Have you ever found yourself staring at a piece of evidence you were not looking for, wondering if you were ready for the truth it held? The silence of the house was entirely new. 4 months earlier, we had dropped Leo off at his university dorm. The drive back was a quiet one, the specific kind of quiet you expect when a major chapter of your life finally closes. Walking into the empty hallway, I felt the profound, heavy shift of an empty nest. Clara, however, had a completely different shift in mind. She did not go to the kitchen to make coffee or sit on the living room couch to decompress. She walked straight to her leather tote bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and set it on the granite island between us. It was not the opening of a discussion. It was a formal transaction. She handed me the divorce papers with a practiced, serene expression. There was no screaming, no thrown plates, no dramatic confessions of deep unhappiness. Instead, she used calm, polished therapy speak. She told me she felt suffocated by the life we had built. She said she needed to reclaim her identity and step out of the shadow of my career. It sounded less like a wife leaving a husband of 22 years, and more like a corporate consultant delivering a quarterly restructuring plan. Looking back now, I realise how incredibly calculated that delivery was. Modern betrayal rarely looks like a screaming match. More often than not, it arrives dressed up as self-care and personal growth. It is a highly effective tactic, designed to make the victim feel like the oppressor, leaving you too disoriented to fight back. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the heavily weighted legal jargon on the pristine white pages. She was not just asking for a clean break or a standard division of our personal assets. She wanted 50% of everything we owned, specifically including the voting shares in the regional freight company I had built from the ground up. Giving up those shares meant giving up operational control of the very enterprise that had funded her comfortable existence for over 2 decades. I did not yell. I did not throw the folder back across the counter. I simply sat there in the quiet kitchen, stunned into a slow, heavy compliance, wondering where the last 20 years had actually gone. I was trying to process the emotional end of a family while she was coldly executing a liquidation. I had been the silent investor in her version of our marriage, and this was her finalizing the buyout. At the time, I did not understand the sheer scale of the operation she had set in motion. I thought I was just losing my marriage. I had no idea I was being targeted for a financial slaughter. Guilt is a highly effective currency. For the better part of a decade, I operated on a rigorous 60-hour weekly schedule. Managing freight dispatches, auditing shipping routes, and negotiating regional contracts took up the bulk of my waking life. The objective had always been entirely straightforward. I needed to secure a lifestyle Clara deemed acceptable, and to ensure Leo graduated from his university without a single cent of debt. I viewed my sheer exhaustion as a necessary operational cost, a long-term investment in our family's equity. If I am being honest with myself, I allowed that exhaustion to become a highly convenient excuse. At the warehouse, I demanded absolute transparency. A missing $50 manifest would trigger an immediate review. I had long ago delegated the administrative back office and vendor disbursements to Clara, viewing it as a way to involve her in the enterprise we were building together. While I was hyper-focused on the operational transparency of my fleet, tracking every gallon of diesel and every mile driven, she held the keys to the accounts payable. She didn't attempt any massive, singular thefts. Instead, she systematically leaked funds through a series of minor, recurring invoices for fleet consulting and auxiliary maintenance. In a logistics firm with a 7-figure overhead, An extra $11,000 a month, spread across 20 fake vendors, looked like nothing more than a standard fluctuation in operating costs. Yet, in my own home, I let a quiet erosion of trust pass without a single question. I convinced myself that paying the bills was the exact same thing as paying attention. Manipulators rely heavily on that specific brand of guilt. It is remarkable how easily you can normalize a shifting baseline in a marriage. It took me years to understand how methodically Clara had executed her withdrawal. Over the last 2 years, her emotional distance grew vast and cold, but she expertly framed that disconnect as a direct consequence of my work schedule. I accepted the liability without looking at the fine print. It was far easier to absorb the blame for our marital decay than to conduct a thorough audit of her daily behaviour. I was too tired to argue, so I simply paid the emotional tax she levied against me. Every relationship has a balance sheet, and ours was bleeding capital. I assumed the deficit was entirely my fault, believing that my ambition to build the freight company was draining the affection from our household. What I failed to recognize was that Clara was not suffering from neglect. She was thriving in the lack of oversight. My absence was not her burden. It was her corporate cover. Because I felt perpetually indebted to her for my long hours, I willfully ignored the operational red flags appearing right in front of me. The steady influx of new designer bags that she casually claimed were purchased on clearance. The passwords to our joint financial accounts that were suddenly updated for supposed security reasons. The increasingly frequent weekend wellness retreats. She insisted she needed to combat her feelings of suffocation. I accepted all of these discrepancies as normal overhead for a struggling marriage. I had been subsidizing a lifestyle while completely failing to review the receipts. I thought my relentless labor was buying us a stable future, but I was merely funding my own replacement. I kept transferring my time, my energy, and my loyalty into an institution that had quietly filed for emotional bankruptcy months ago. I was still fulfilling my daily role as the provider. But the woman I was working to support had not been my wife for a very long time. The mediation room was a sterile site for an execution. We sat across a polished mahogany table, flanked by our respective legal counsel. What had initially been presented as an amicable division of assets rapidly escalated into a hostile takeover. Clara's demands shifted from mildly unreasonable to entirely predatory. She was no longer asking for a clean 50% of our shared history. Her revised term sheet demanded exorbitant spousal support for the next 15 years, and enough voting rights to effectively paralyse any executive decision I made at the firm. When I finally balked at the sheer audacity of the request, the operational atmosphere shifted. Clara did not raise her voice. She simply folded her hands, offered a cold, detached stare, and let her attorney do the heavy lifting. Her lawyer, a sharp professional in a tailored grey suit, leaned forward and quietly deployed their true leverage. She suggested, in the most measured tone possible, that litigating this divorce in open court might become deeply problematic for my corporate reputation. She casually mentioned that allegations of severe anger issues and a highly controlling nature could easily become a matter of permanent public record. It was a calculated procedural extortion. They were banking on my fear of a public smear campaign to force a rapid, undisputed settlement. My own attorney, a pragmatic man who understood the brutal machinery of family court, pulled me into the hallway. He did not offer me any false hope or cinematic promises of justice. Instead, he delivered a cold risk analysis. He warned me that the system has an unparalleled ability to destroy a business owner's credibility overnight, regardless of whether the allegations hold any actual factual weight. Fighting a prolonged, highly publicized legal battle could paralyze the freight company's daily operations and entirely drain our capital reserves. His professional advice was to swallow the loss, sign the paper, and stop the bleeding. It took me months to understand that justice in those rooms is rarely about the truth. It is simply a negotiation of leverage. The emotional deficit of the past 60 days had severely drained my capacity to fight. I felt cornered by a system explicitly designed to extract maximum value with minimum friction. The psychological pressure was immense, a heavy, suffocating liability pressing down on my chest. I was genuinely ready to sign away half my existence just to buy a modicum of peace. However, I am not a man who operates without contingencies. While Clara and her legal team were busy drafting the final surrender documents, I executed one quiet, logistical maneuver. I discreetly transferred my personal emergency fund, $85,000, from a premarital inheritance I'd kept strictly segregated from our joint operations into a secure, newly established account, just hours before she could successfully petition a judge to freeze our marital assets. It was a minor procedural victory, but it ensured I retained a baseline of liquidity. Still, the overarching reality remained incredibly bleak. The final settlement papers were printed and sitting on my desk. The terms were draconian. I was exactly one pen stroke away from losing my life's work. Then, Leo came home for Thanksgiving. Discovery rarely arrives with a warning label. It was late November, during the holiday break, when Leo returned for a brief visit. The house felt marginally warmer with him in it, though the pending settlement cast a long, sterile shadow over the weekend. On Saturday afternoon, Leo was rummaging through the kitchen junk drawer in search of a specific charging cable. Instead, he pulled out Clara's old tablet. It was a device she had discarded 2 years prior because of a spiderweb crack across the glass. She had kept the damaged unit only because it held the unbacked-up photos of Leo's childhood, arrogantly assuming the shattered screen acted as a physical deadbolt to the digital ghosts hidden inside. She had replaced it the very next day. She had never bothered to wipe the hard drive. She was a master of interpersonal manipulation, but she suffered from the classic arrogance of the non-technical. She believed that once a screen went dark, the secrets stored behind it simply ceased to exist. When Leo plugged it into the wall to test a cable, the device powered on. Because her cloud account had never been deauthorized from this hardware, a forced system update triggered upon connection. 2 years of hidden, backlogged communications began to flood the screen as the sync protocol overrode her outdated privacy settings. Leo did not shout or make a scene. He walked into my home office and quietly set the cracked silver device on my desk. It sat there on the mahogany surface, a dormant explosive waiting to detonate. I read the messages. The primary thread was with a man named Marcus, a mid-level executive at a competing regional freight firm. The infidelity was obvious, detailed, and completely devoid of guilt. Looking back now, the margin between survival and total corporate ruin was terrifyingly thin. If Leo had simply purchased a new cable at his campus bookstore, or if he had opened the left drawer instead of the right, I would have signed that settlement agreement by the end of the month. I would have handed over 50% of my equity, voting control of my board, and a lifetime of alimony, entirely blind to the reality of the transaction. My life's work would have been legally transferred to a competitor. The immediate human instinct in that situation is catastrophic confrontation. You want to print the transcripts, drive to her leased apartment, and demand an explanation. But you do not survive a corporate assault with raw emotion. You survive it with strict procedure. I did not call Clara. I locked the device in my safe and contacted a forensic accountant I had used for corporate audits. We endured 3 agonizing weeks of silence. While Clara's legal team aggressively pressed for my signature on the surrender documents, my accountant was quietly cross-referencing the timestamps on her messages with my company's financial ledgers. The patience required to do things legally and correctly, rather than giving in to the visceral urge to confront the betrayer immediately, is excruciating. It requires a very specific kind of discipline to smile at the executioner while you silently dismantle the gallows. When the preliminary audit returned, the scope of the liability became clear. We did not just find out she was cheating, we found the blueprint of my execution. True betrayal is always buried in the paperwork. The forensic accountant, a quiet, meticulous man named David, called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. He did not offer me coffee or pleasantries. He simply slid a heavy, bound folder across his glass desk. The audit was complete, and the liability was staggering. Clara had not just been unfaithful. She had been operating a highly sophisticated, sustained corporate bleed. David walked me through the ledgers, line by line. Over the course of 3 years, Clara had established 2 dummy limited liability companies. They were phantom vendors, routinely billing my freight business for logistics, consulting, and fleet maintenance services that never actually existed. Marcus had used his position at our competitor to provide Clara with legitimate-looking rate tables and professional invoice templates. He knew exactly what price points would trigger an automatic red flag in a logistics audit and taught her how to stay just $1 below the threshold of suspicion. The funds, totaling nearly $400,000, were routed seamlessly into a hidden account jointly controlled by Clara and Marcus. Looking back now, I realize that the most devastating wounds in life do not come from screaming matches. They come from a spreadsheet. She had been sitting across from me at our kitchen table, drinking the coffee I brewed every morning, while systematically dismantling my financial infrastructure. But the embezzlement was not the bottom of the abyss. David turned to the back of the folder, where he had printed specific transcripts extracted from the recovered device. He pointed to a highlighted exchange from mid-October, just weeks before she had handed me the divorce papers. The narrative slowed down in my mind as I looked at the page. I read the words carefully, letting the cold, sterile calculation of her messages sink into my bones. Marcus had sent a message asking what their contingency plan was if I decided to fight the exorbitant alimony demands. Clara's response was typed out in stark, undeniable text. If he refuses the settlement, I will file the restraining order. My lawyer says the threat of an abuse claim will make him sign anything. I sat in the quiet hum of the accountant's office and read those 2 sentences 3 times. The sheer banality of the exchange was what chilled me. They were discussing the total eradication of my reputation with the exact same casual tone one might use to order lunch. The parameters of our conflict shifted instantly. This was no longer a standard family court dispute over shared assets or a broken marriage. Clara was entirely prepared to manufacture a domestic abuse allegation, jeopardize my personal freedom, and obliterate my corporate standing, all to ensure her financial extraction went smoothly. I was not negotiating a divorce. I was negotiating a hostage situation. And in a hostage situation, you do not compromise. You neutralize the threat. I drove straight to my attorney's office. When I showed him the forensic report and the printed transcripts, his previous advice to settle evaporated. The dynamic had officially shifted from a civil family dispute to a clear-cut case of interstate wire fraud and attempted extortion, automatically bringing the matter under federal scrutiny. I instructed him to schedule a formal, recorded deposition under the strict guise of finalizing Clara's settlement terms. To ensure her attendance, I agreed to every preliminary demand her legal team requested over the next 48 hours. I projected the exact image of a defeated, exhausted man who was finally ready to surrender his equity. She thought she was walking into a routine deposition to claim her prize. She was actually walking into a trap. The deposition room was entirely devoid of oxygen. We gathered in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room on the 14th floor of my attorney's office building. The court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers hovering over the steno machine, ready to document my formal surrender. Clara sat directly across from me, wearing a tailored navy suit and a serene, victorious smile. She radiated the relaxed confidence of a corporate raider who had successfully cornered her target. She fully expected me to sign away 50% of my equity, hand over voting control of my board, and agree to lifetime alimony just to make the pressure stop. There was absolutely no cinematic shouting. There were no dramatic confessions or overturned chairs. Real power operates in complete silence. My lawyer, a man who understood the surgical precision required for this specific extraction, opened his briefcase. He did not present the standard settlement agreement Clara's team had drafted. Instead, he pulled out a thick, heavy binder and slid it across the polished mahogany table. He calmly asked Clara to identify a series of corporate documents. He started with the incorporation papers for the 2 dummy logistics companies she had set up with Marcus. Then, he presented the 74 fraudulent vendor invoices she had routed through my accounting department over the last 3 years. Clara's smile faltered. She glanced at her attorney, who was suddenly leaning forward, his professional detachment replaced by sharp, immediate concern. But my lawyer was not finished. He turned to the final tab in the binder. He placed the printed transcripts of her text messages precisely in the center of the table. He asked her for the official record to verify the messages sent from her cloud account on October 14th, specifically the ones detailing her intent to file a fabricated domestic abuse report if I refused her financial demands. If I am being honest, watching her in that exact moment was a profound education in human psychology. Her entire sense of superiority was an illusion, a luxury she had leased, using my money and my willful blindness. The instant her access to my capital was revoked, the facade evaporated. There was no foundational character beneath the tailored suit, no internal value left to keep her standing once her leverage was legally dismantled. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the court reporter's keyboard. Clara looked desperately to her lawyer for a lifeline, expecting him to object, to yell, to deploy some legal maneuver to save her. He did none of those things. He read the highlighted text messages, looked at the forensic audit, and realized his client had committed multiple felonies. He signaled the court reporter to stop and looked at Clara with cold, professional detachment. "We are taking a recess," he stated firmly. "I am advising my client to exercise her Fifth Amendment right and remain silent until we have consulted with a criminal defense specialist." She did not scream or run. She just sat there, watching her perfect future turn to ash. The fallout was not a victory lap. It was simply the conclusion of a highly complex audit. State prosecutors took over the embezzlement case, and the family court judge, presented with undeniable proof of corporate fraud and extortion, finalized the divorce with swift, clinical efficiency. I retained 100% of my equity, the voting shares, and every single cent of the capital I had built. Clara was left to navigate a federal indictment with an overworked public defender, as her previous attorney had officially withdrawn representation the morning after our deposition. Marcus was immediately terminated from his firm and formally named as a co-conspirator in the ongoing federal investigation. They had tried to execute a hostile takeover, but they ended up completely bankrupting their own futures. But dismantling a 22-year lie does not leave you feeling like a winner. It leaves you deeply, profoundly exhausted. Leo and I spent the next year slowly restructuring our dynamic. It is a strange, quiet grief to navigate the trauma of a fractured family alongside your adult son. We did not talk about her court dates or the sentencing guidelines. We talked about his university classes, his new logistics internship, and the future. I had to learn how to be present, not just as a provider of tuition and shelter, but as a reliable, emotionally available foundation. It took me years to understand that providing capital is the easiest part of fatherhood. Providing presence requires a much heavier, continuous investment. If I am being honest, the hardest part of the recovery was not the legal battle. The legal battle was merely paperwork, a procedural dismantling of a physical threat. The true cost of this ordeal was the cognitive dissonance, the agonizing psychological toll of reconciling the woman I thought I had married with the corporate raider sitting across from me in that conference room. You spend decades trusting a partner, sharing a bed, building an empire, only to realize the person you loved never actually existed. They were a projection, a carefully managed public relations campaign designed to keep you producing capital while they siphoned the profits out the back door. Betrayal on that scale alters your fundamental understanding of reality. You question every memory, every anniversary dinner, every quiet moment in the living room. Was any of it real? Or was I just a highly profitable mark? Society heavily conditions the provider to absorb all the blame for a failing household. When she claimed she was suffocated, I immediately audited my own behaviour. I assumed the operational deficit was entirely mine. I accepted the guilt because accepting guilt felt like taking responsibility. But responsibility requires two solvent partners. I was trying to balance a ledger that she was actively, maliciously manipulating. It is a terrifying realization that someone you love can look you in the eye, identify your deepest insecurities, in my case, the fear of failing my family, and weaponize them to extract maximum leverage. They do not just steal your money, they steal your grip on reality. You do not survive a betrayal like this by being angry forever. Anger is a volatile, highly inefficient fuel. It burns you out and leaves you with nothing but ash. You survive it by realizing that truth, no matter how much it costs to uncover, is the only foundation you can actually build a life on. An ugly, devastating truth is infinitely more valuable than a beautiful, comfortable lie. I had spent years subsidizing a comfortable lie because I was too tired to conduct a thorough audit of my own life. I will never make that operational error again. Today, the freight company is operating at peak efficiency. I no longer work 60-hour weeks. I hired a competent operations manager because I finally realized my time is the most valuable asset I possess. I do not spend it blindly anymore. My circle of trust is small, highly vetted, and strictly maintained. I am at peace. It is a quiet, deliberate peace, purchased at a remarkably high price, but it belongs entirely to me. Manipulators rely on your exhaustion. They rely on your guilt, your dedication, and your willingness to look the other way just to keep the peace. They rely on you not looking too closely. So, look closely. The truth is always waiting in the dark. Have you ever experienced something like this, where a sudden discovery forced you to completely reevaluate a relationship you thought was secure? If this story resonated with you, I would really like to hear your perspective.